our listeners. We had started this tete-a-tete. Unfortunately, technology made it very impossible for you, our listeners, to listen to our conversation with Brother Mlambo. But we'll start. Unfortunately, we were not aware that people could not hear us. Thanks to my brother Owen Chari, who then intervened and made it, and Sister Noki, and made it aware to us that citizens could not hear us. This tete-a-tete, today's conversation, we're looking at Zimbabwe, what is the way forward with Brother Mlambo. We are conversating about the solution to rescue Zimbabwe from this crisis. Many conversations have been, fellow Zimbabweans, about the political crisis in our country and how we intend to resolve the political question, and so many conversations on the political front. And limited discourse and conversation has been channeled around how we exit from this crisis. How do we envision a new Zimbabwe? What is the nature of the state that we want to see? And few questions that I had been responding to around the situation in our country and the proposition about how do we exit from the crisis in our country and what solutions do we have. So I'm going to ensure that I add Brother Mlambo as the co-host so that we are able to continue with the conversation. If Brother Mlambo, if you can accept the invitation to be a co-host in this space, so that we can have this tete-a-tete on the characterization of the Zimbabwean problem and how we intend to rescue our country and what we propose as the way forward. So I would try to ensure that Brother Mlambo, you are a co-host and you are a speaker, so that if you can request Comrade Brother Mlambo, and then we'll be able to begin the conversation. Unfortunately, we had gone further to on the conversation, not realizing that Zimbabweans were not following the conversation. Let me ensure that Brother Mlambo, I'll also uh, uh, ensure that yes. Let me also I would invite Brother Mlambo if you can accept that. Thank you. Brother Mlambo, I can see you are now a speaker. Confirm that you can hear me.
I can hear you, Comrade OSTALOS, just to check me as well.
I can hear you, fellow citizens. Can you confirm that you can hear us so that we can proceed to the conversation of the day? You can drop 100 if you can hear us loud and clear. Thank you very much. I'm going to Brother Mlambo. I'm going to go back to the first question that you had asked. How do we characterize the Zimbabwean problem? And I'll go back to the 7 points that I just put. The Zimbabwe is facing a plethora of problems, but for the purpose of the conversation today, the characterization of the Zimbabwean problem in our respectful view is in the following respect. The first and major problem that we're facing in our country is the crisis of extreme poverty. Data shows that over 49% of Zimbabweans are living under a poverty data line. That it means that majority of our people over 30% are living in US less than $1 a day. So that's extreme poverty. The second characterization of the problem, which informs our discussion today, the question of widening inequality. You realize that 10% of a people control 40% plus of the income in our country. So the inequality gap in our country is the second characterization of the problem. The third characterization, Bram Lambo, that I spoke about is the question of unemployment. Data shows that over 90% of Zimbabweans are unemployed. But we must go deeper in characterizing the question of unemployment. Of the 85%, we must look at the demographic groups because this is going to be important in our conversation about industrialization. The demographic group that is affected by unemployment in this country are young people. The recent statistics show that over of young people are unemployed or a few of them underemployed. What this means is that of the few young people that wake up to go to work, whether in the formal or the informal sector, majority of them are underemployed, which means they are earning less than what they are supposed to be getting. So that is the characterization of the problem. And you see why that data is important when you talk about industrialization. You realize that graduates are now selling tomatoes and 1,000 leaving our country in search of greener pastures to go and work either as waitress and waiters in restaurant, and some now taking care of older people in Europe. Number four, in our characterization of the problem, is the question of the currency of our country. We've got a fragile currency. We've changed the currencies since independence like no any other country in the world. So the question of hyperinflation and currency instability is the fourth characterization of our problem that we would want to service in our country. Everything is collapsed. You can call an ambulance in our and expect a decay and the collapse in the public service sector. Or capitalization in our country is a big issue. Number seven that I've spoken about is the question of the rising public debt. Our country owes over 1 billion, and much of it is owed to private creditors and is in arrears. So it's a big issue. So this is how, in our view, we characterize the crisis in our country. And I'd gone ahead, brother, we propose that the conversation about the solution start in our respectful view of philosophical and ideological question. Zimbabwe at the present moment must answer the philosophical and ideological terms of so you realize that we undermine the debate and discourse on the country's ideological trust and ideological direction. But this is important because it informs our program of action, it informs our policies, it informs the political culture in the country, and it informs the nature and character and content. Three things. It informs the nature, the character, and the content of the state policy. If I had time, I was going to touch on the history of the state pre-independence and post-independence. But you realize that in the liberation struggle, the envisioning of the state was that the state must be a Marxist-Leninist egalitarian state. Because those who participated in the liberation struggle of suffrage and poverty and racism would be successfully resolved by a scientific socialist Zimbabwe. That is what the liberation struggle envisioned. But in the process, we obviously saw the deviation, the changes. Now Mugabe being knighted by the Queen of England and obviously embracing ISAP and the challenges that came with the neoliberal order of post 2000 and the question and the rapid industrialization that then followed, the retrenchment of the working class and the informalization of the economy that came, and the shorter break that we witnessed in 2008 up to 2018, and of course the default mode that we went back from 2013 to present. So you realize that post-independence, the philosophical disposition of the state was informed by Marxism because it intended to resolve the questions of race. It was informed with the intention to resolve the questions of poverty and the questions of blackness. At the current juncture now, our proposition now in terms of the character, in terms of the nature, in terms of the content of the state, we propose that Zimbabwe ought to be led by what we frame as a developmental state. And I'd gone, Brother Mlambo, to define the characteristics of a developmental state. We touched on the leadership question that we must be conversation about. So, this state-led development is what we are proposing. The world is divided into those that are convinced that the private sector must lead development, and those of us that are convinced that the state must lead development. So we are convinced that to rescue Zimbabwe from the current crisis, the state must lead development. Why should the state lead development? It is important because the state will have to address the historical challenges that ordinary Zimbabweans, particularly the majority that have been impoverished, which we talked about when we in the crisis, the question of the 49% of Zimbabweans living below poverty datum line. It is the state that must be able to collect tax, that must be able to industrialize, that must be able to create conducive environment for investment, that will be able to protect and redistribute wealth for the benefit of those who don't have, so that we balance the inequality question in our country. So the model that we are proposing of a developmental state start on the question of stewardship. I'm going to summarize, Brother Mlambo, for our listeners on today's Tête-à-tête on the leadership question in our country. The developmental state model talks about three things: the need for honest, accountable, and competent leaders. Three things. It is important that in our redefinition of the role of the state, we talk about the role of stewardship. That is what our country lacks. It lacks stewardship. So the state that must lead development is not an imaginary state that exists there as a robot. It is a state that is filled by men and women of our own country. So that's why this conversation about stewardship and the character of the people. And I want to underline this. There is a disconjecture when we talk about stewardship in our country. People think that the question of stewardship is a question of morality, that our country is in search of people, men and women that are moral. No, Brother Mlap, not what we are looking for. We are looking for honest, competent, and capable people. That's what we are looking for. We are not looking for men and women who are moral. That is the role of the church. The church deals with the moral fabric of a society. The state must have people that are honest, that cannot steal from the taxpayers, but that are also competent. We were just recently given a report as Zimbabweans by compatriots in Dagab who were talking about the degrees. Many Zimbabweans, particularly in this micro-blocking side, started calling themselves doctors, engineers, and so forth. Because we woke up to the realization that people that we have been calling doctors for years are not doctors. People that we have been saluting Brother Mlambo for years and saying that they are sources of inspiration as people who have achieved postgraduate studies, we realized that they don't have. Zimcheya started to characterize these bogus institutions and return everyone back to the formal education systems that we have in our country. So the question of competence is important. So on one hand, we struck that there is a question of dishonest and there's a question of incompetence. And the two are a disaster, Brother Mlam. The two are a disaster. At least you must say if you are dishonest, at least be competent. Then that's subjective. But when you have got the tyranny of the two, you are incompetent, you are dishonest, and you're not accountable, that's a disaster. That is the characterization of the leadership question in our country. Then on leadership, we had also talked about the issue of we would need to have a lean government. We must begin the discourse in our country whether do 14 million Zimbabweans really require to have this bloated cabinet that we have in our country. We must look at the debate and discourse whether or not our country requires to have, for example, deputy ministers. What is the role of deputy ministers? We must begin to critically interrogate that because we need to have a lean government. We must even go and debate whether or not do 14 million Zimbabweans need 210 members of parliament. So the question of this decentralization again comes into play on the leadership question. We must ensure that every country that has developed has dealt with issue of public expenditure, issue of foreign travels, question around perks for public officials, and these perks are not limited to public officials like members of parliament, councillors, government officials. It goes to the state bureaucracy, permanent secretaries, directors, and so forth. We must look at that because the question of culture is going to be very important. I'll quickly summarize now on the program that we had proposed around the question to rescue our country so that you can come in, Brother Mlambo. In summary, I had touched on the question of ensuring that we deal with the agriculture sector as the first and most important anchor. So the agriculture sector plays a critical role in the developmental state model. Currently, agriculture employs 60 to 70% of the population. Of course, informalized. And because there is low productivity, but it is the consumer. It consumes about 60 to 70% of those employed in the informal sector. So the first thing that a government must be able to do is proper investment on agriculture. Because this is an industry that has a potential of creating 1 million decent jobs. These are formal jobs that we're talking about. And I touched on how do we do that. We have to industrialize the agriculture sector. How do we do it, Brother Mlambites? We proposed that we must look at the question of value addition. So instead of ensuring that our people just produce, we must make sure that the first thing that must happen, government must support farmers. That's the first thing, not this current partisan, chaotic, corrupt financing of agriculture. Proper financing. An ordinary farmer, a subsistence farmer must be able to get a loan from the bank. And number two, because the first thing of a government is to feed our people. Our major crisis in Zimbabwe is poverty. So the first thing before we talk about any other thing that a political leader will talk about, the first thing we must do is we must feed our people. We must end the crisis of hunger. Our people are waking up at the blessing of empty stomachs. So that's the first thing that we must cure, the question of poverty. And to end poverty, we must ensure that we rapidly grow the agriculture sector. We also propose that the state now plays a very crucial role, but in partnerships with the private sector to ensure that we establish localized manufacturing industries. We must manufacture fertilizer. We must manufacture seed in our country. And of course, irrigation equipment is very key. But more importantly, there is no conversation about research. We must invest in research in the agriculture sector. Reform is very important in the agriculture sector. Look at the conversation around cooperatives, the issues around accountability and land use. We must also talk about how to modernize the railway system in our country, because it's going to be a very critical role of the agriculture sector. So it's very important to ensure that we revive and modernize institutions like cold storage, obviously for beef production and different value chains. There is no reason, in our view, why we should continue importing milk from South Africa. There is no reason why we should import apple juice from South Africa. There's no reason why we should be importing oranges from South Africa. So agriculture plays the first important anchor of our developmental state, and that's the conversation that we are proposing. We expand, of course, in our policy proposition around this, and we can have other days to touch on that. And lastly, we talked about the mining sector. The mining sector, Brother Mlambo, I touched on it because it's the second most important anchor. Some argue that mining sector is the major employer in our country, but that's not the truth. While mining sector contributes 60% of the export earning in our country, it only employs 2% of the former jobs in our country. So that's the irony. That's the challenge that we're facing. And to resolve the crisis in the mining sector, the first of it, of course, I'm going to touch on that when we talk about corruption, is the question of dealing with illicit financial flows. That's the first thing. The Auditor General, I'm going to touch on that on corruption, talks about we lose at least 0.2 billion per annum on illicit outflow of gold alone. And people are not outraged. That's the irony of our Christian country. This is an industry that has a potential of employing almost 500,000 of the Zimbabwean population, but with a lot of spillovers in the distribution value chain. Because when you start mining, it means that you also start to transport. So you are transport industry and so forth. So what we propose in the mining sector first is to ensure that we must build local beneficiation capacity. There is no reason why we lose lithium into trucks to Beijing. There is no reason why most of our lithium can flow in a very unfashionable manner to Mozambique. There is absolutely no reason. What the government ought to do is talk about value beneficiation. We must be talking about how to manufacture batteries in our country. We must talk about anode production in our own country. If you look at value beneficiation gold, why should we not talking about minting around jewelry in our country? If you look at chrome, can contribute hugely into the stainless industry. So the question of value beneficiation is very, very pivotal and important. And the state that is not corrupt plays a pivotal role on that. And then there is a issue around ensuring that there is proper regulation of mining sector, because these leakages are as a product of lack of regulation, the lack of law and order in our country, the animal farm kingdom. So there is a law for genuine miners and the law for the connected miners in the country. So that animal kingdom scenario ought to be resolved. Lastly, on the mining sector is about transformation. How do we transform the ASM, the artisan and small scale mining sector, has to be transformed into informal cooperatives so that you fit into the legal supply chains. There is no need in our country why we should continue with the Makorokozas and the machete wielding gangs, particularly in the Midlands province. We ought to talk about how do we transform the ASM so that people then continue to formally contribute to the legal and financial value chain of our country. And lastly, we obviously have to ensure that there is state equity, particularly in the strategic minerals, so that investment is invited in the country. So that lack of that I talked the industrialization program is going to be informed first by the agriculture sector, secondly by the mining sector. So basically, I touched on that, Brother Mlambo, and I'll allow you to take the conversation. I thought that I will just quickly go through what we had talked about in terms of the development model that we propose for the motherland, where the state plays a pivotal role in development. I thank you. Brother Mlambo, I see that you have dropped. Let me re-invite you again so that we can see that you can come in, Brother Mlambo. If you can accept.
Comrade OSTALOS, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
I hope if you can hear me, then the rest of the participants can equally hear me as well. Wow. Firstly, let me appreciate you taking, firstly, actually, let me apologize to compatriots that our first space, I think the way we had set it up was into the video space, and I think that affected our sound. We are learning. Yeah, we are, you know, one thing in life that we are constantly learning and discovering our own ignorance, as Yuval Hariri would say. So apologies for that sound glitch. And in 35 minutes, literally, it was just Comrade OSTALOS and myself, and possibly one other person who were hearing us, and the rest were not hearing. But I appreciate the patience and the endurance. Speaks a lot about the endurance of the people of Zimbabwe. So, Comrade OSTALOS, wow, where do I even begin? So you had to go back and you spoke about, okay, what is the nature of the crisis? And everyone knows the crisis in Zimbabwe. We don't need to talk about the. Everyone knows about the crisis, and you gave us a synopsis of that particular crisis. Interestingly, you touched on this. I mean, quite frankly, two key sectors of that the Zimbabwean economy is anchored or hinged on, i.e., agriculture, and to some extent, you spoke about mining. So this is me just trying to summarize. You spoke about the need to industrialize. Means when you industrialize, if I got you correctly, you're moving from subsistence-based agriculture to manufacturing, to a manufacturing-based economy. And for that to happen, you have to ensure that there are both forward and backward linkages in the agricultural sector so that it grows. And that obviously requires technology, investment, financial investment, human capital. I think you spoke about the agri-tech officers, Matumeni, the popular known as Matumeni, in Zimbabwean lingo. Right? The same applies to the mining sector. If I got you correctly again, your conversation was on how do we create downstream industry. I think I heard you talk about jewelry, the manufacturing of jewelry and stuff like that. How do we create downstream industries in a very capital intensive sector such as mining, which already is giving us a lot of foreign currency receipts as it stands, but only employs, to quote you, 2% of the working force. So to make sure that mining becomes a labor intensive sector, we need to create downstream industries. And as you said, that one of the ways to do so is to add value to our minerals. Importantly, we also then mentioned the issue of illicit financial flows, and especially in the gold sector. And this is a conversation that you rarely find in Zimbabwean public. I'm very happy that you brought it on this space and you spoke about it. In passing, that it's a very, very important matter. That the people might think that no, we are just throwing around figures, but the National Prosecuting Authority, the Prosecutor General, Justice Matanda Moyo, the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, right? These are state institutions. They reported that the Minister of Home Affairs, Kazembe 3 years ago, reported that we are losing 120 million US dollars per day, per month, in gold leakages and illicit finance leakages in the gold sector alone, because the artisanal small-scale mining, i.e. the context of gold, is not formalized, right? So we need to hammer on the need for transparent and accountable governance. And Comrade OSTALOS, the role that citizens play in holding the government and its various institutions to account remains very, very pivotal. Because if it's not a foreign entity, if it's not a foreign media house, if it's the government itself or an institution of the self itself saying we are losing 120 million per month, that translates to 1.2 billion US dollars being lost per year. Then the citizens must equally shape up and say, what is happening to our money? What is happening? What role are the security services playing in plugging those leakages? Are they equipped enough? Right. So I think this point needs to be hammered home again and again, that the question of accountability, the question of transparency in the governance of our mineral resources remains very, very vital if we are to realize the developmental aspirations you are talking about of making Zimbabwe a developmental state. So I hope that this starts a conversation on demanding accountability from the state, right? The fourth component that I want us to talk about, Comrade OSTALOS, is the role of the diaspora in the developmental state, right? What role then can the diaspora or should the diaspora play if they are given the right to vote or in terms of fair investment opportunities or seeding back their skills? Today, actually, the Minister of Skills Development, Skills Audit and Skills Development, Professor Mavima, tweeted that they are developing a new diaspora policy in Zimbabwe. And they seek to incorporate the diaspora in what they're calling the Zimbabwe becoming an upper middle income economy by 2030. Question is, in the developmental state model, what role does the diaspora play, Comrade OSTALOS?
Thank you, Brother Mlambo. And we must characterize the current proposition by the professor in the proper context. Because my capable a fellow academic misses the points with a huge margin. Because they propose that. So kudos to the proposition around the diaspora policy. It is important to have a diaspora policy. Zimbabwe has had a huge brain drain over the past 2 decades. So it is important to talk about our program in terms of the diaspora. The first contribution by comparison in the diaspora is obvious in terms of skills transfer. So the skills in the diaspora are very, very crucial. Zimbabweans are in the top of industries world over. And I was listening recently to a cry by exhausted patriots that why would Strive Masiwa invest in South Africa and not in his own country? It goes back to the conversation, Brother Mlambo, about ensuring that our investment policy must always look at both the domestic and international investment. How to ensure that we create a conducive environment for Zimbabweans and a deliberate program. So you're talking about the question around ease of doing business. You're talking about how the financial sector reform. I'm going to touch on that when you talk about corruption in the financial sector. So the issue of investment, both by domestic investors and of course international and external investors, is very, very key. Because the diaspora, the pivotal question which the professor avoided in their proposition is very simple. Forget all the nice words about the development of a database, which is very important. We must have a skills database of Zimbabweans. Where are you? What are you doing? So that we know how do we transfer those skills from the diaspora to Zimbabwe. But at the end of the day, you see how it is politics stupid. Because you realize that one of the major contributors in our country's financial sector is the diaspora through remittances, right? Which is a good and a welcome development that every Zimbabwean, both within the ruling and the alternative spaces, all Zimbabweans are agreeing within the political economy of our country that diaspora contributes in terms of remittances and it's a good thing. But there's a point of congestion now that the minister avoids. The minister avoids the critical conversation about the right to vote for the people in diaspora. There lies the issue. Why, Brother Mlambo? Is because you cannot have taxation without representation. Even a first year political science student will tell you that if I pay tax, I must be represented. Why? Because I'm giving my tax to a certain political elite which claims that it will take the tax and redistribute it. Therefore, that elite must take its mandate from me as a taxpayer. That is the basis of taxation. The first rule of taxation is that it must come with representation. But we've effected this question in the context of Zimbabwe, and we want diaspora people to continue pay remittances, but without them enjoying the right to vote. So a developmental state must be able to be cognizant of that right. That Zimbabweans in the diaspora must be able to be given a right to choose because we are taxing them. They are contributing to the economy. So beyond the mapping of diaspora, beyond the characterization of different sectors and skills that the people in the diaspora possess, the conversation must also be about concretely in the reform agenda of our country must be about how to ensure that the diaspora contributes in terms of their right to choose leaders when that opportune moment comes in Zimbabwe, which happens according to the constitution after every 5 years. So I would say that this is the contribution I would make in the question of the diaspora.
Thank you, Comrade Ostalos. In the so there are so many issues that I wanted to explore with you, but I am realizing that in terms of time, because we lost 5 minutes already when the sound was not perfect, and I'm realizing that time has actually moved. But I still have three, if the people can bear with me, three more components to go through with you, Comrade Ostalos. Then I promise to open the floor, if that's okay with you, Comrade Ostalos.
Go ahead, brother.
Okay, so I want to ask the three components that I have, but I'll summarize, right, in this way. One, how do we break the cycle of corruption and impunity? In 2 to 3 sentences, Comrade Ostalos, how do we break the cycle of corruption and impunity in a developmental state?
Thank you, brother Mlambo. But you see, in 3 sentences, it will be difficult to unpack this. So maybe we Zimbabweans ought to look at the corruption index. Our country is number 158 out of 180 countries. The ranking on corruption tells you the story. We are one of the considered highly corrupt countries, not in the continent, but in the globe. And the recent, I will just touch one example, but there are so many conversations we would have wanted to, probably we must have another tete-a-tete on corruption alone. Because we have to look at the history of corruption, particularly in the post-independent state, going back to the Willowgate scandal, and how people who were centrally the Willowgate scandal are now driving key agendas of our country in this very day. That's the challenge of our country. How do you expect to have confidence when people know that this one was one of the founders of corrupt cultures in the country, but is in the helm of a government bureaucrat? But that's a conversation we have in another day. But I was looking, Brother Mlambo, at a report by the South African Financial Intelligence. And this report has been dominant. Many Zimbabweans are talking about it, that RBZ transferred 1.1 billion US dollars into the South African account, which was the money from the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission to supply allegedly elections material. And 800 million of this money, which is 70+% of this money, goes into other private companies and start to buy lavish goods, vehicles, and so forth that have been being distributed in our country like confetti. Now, many Zimbabweans are talking about this in the respect of just our money is being stolen in buying cars. Some Zimbabweans, particularly those within the ruling establishment, are saying, no, we must protect it because these people are soiling the name of our compatriots in the party. Now, let me hasten to say this, not just as someone belonging to the alternative politics, but as an ordinary Zimbabwean. This is not a, of course, it started as a finance issue, corruption issue. Our money was stolen, 1 billion was stolen. It went there into the electoral process itself. It started to damage the credibility of the election itself. But that's again another debate of another day. But I'll talk about why it is important for every Zimbabwean. I started by talking about the financial sector reform, rather Mlambo. And we started conversing with people in the financial sector to try and ask them the implications of this. And many Zimbabweans are not paying attention because they think this is just one case of corruption. What this case would do is that once this money, as it has been seen in the reports, has been characterized as public sector money laundering, that's a different conversation altogether. When we are starting to be flagged as a transnational money launderer country, it means that it's no longer a ZEC issue. It's no longer a corruption issue. It's now a Zimbabwean issue because very soon that issue is going to attract the financial task force globally to begin to investigate. The AFTF is going to start investigating Zimbabwe. What will follow is that our country will get a risk of being grey listed. Now, being grey listed is not a small issue. Those that know the situation of 2008 can tell. It means that you will see many banks closing down. It means that you see the difficulty in the financial sector to move money. But more importantly, what the AFFT looks at, it will look at one, the risk issue for our country. It means that anyone who would invest would look at the challenges that they would know that if you move your money in the country, there is a high risk that the public sector corruption is going to encroach into your bank. That's why many people now don't trust our brick and mortar buildings called the banks. Because it will mean that once we are grey listed, it will mean that banks are going to start to move. But we will also be listed as a risky country. So it's no longer just a single scandal of corruption. It will attract the global financial architecture to look at the case of Zimbabwe. And that will bring a very huge problem for our country. Because once we're a high-risk country, it means investment can come in. It means that people can move their money. It means that it will be very difficult for anyone, even in the diaspora, to begin to send their money because all these outlets will begin to close down because of the risk factor. So we ought to look at this question from that perspective. And now, and this is just in the financial sector. That's why financial sector reform is very, 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 very important, Brother Mlambo. Number two, the issue of illicit financial flows that I talked about. If we are losing 1.2 billion per annum on illicit outflow of gold alone, that's a huge problem. But that is a money that could be used for infrastructure development and so forth. And we've not touched into the scandals in lithium, in diamond, and so forth. So basically, the solution is obviously in the following respect. One, we must be able to strengthen institutions of the state. That's why we talked about the state playing a crucial role, but we must redefine the occupants of the state. But that's where the question will go back to the question of stewardship. Secondly, there's a question of impunity in our country. Impunity and accountability are going to be very critical issues to resolve some of the crises in terms of dealing with corruption. If you look at the Auditor General's report, it's just but a report that we read as political scientists and other interested parties and talk about it, and nothing really happens because of the question of impunity. That it depends on who is doing it. Look at the incapacity of the NPA, the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, and so forth. So even strengthening of the independent anti-corruption courts, because it must not end with the research. Our intelligence services in the financial sector do more work in terms of unearthing the movements of money laundering, both domestically and internationally. But the question is, how do we build independent anti-corruption court to ensure. And lastly, what is important on corruption is making sure that punitive measures are put into play. Look at countries like China, which were taking a leaf, by the way, in a developmental model. Look at countries like Singapore. So we must look at the question about how do we deal with corruption. So conversation around death sentence must come into discourse in our country so that there are deterrent measures of people who are found looting public funds. So it's a whole culture issue, but there's a whole issue around law and order, a strengthened, genuine law and order in a country, and capacitation of these law enforcement agencies and Chapter 12 institutions in our country. So I'll say in summary, these are some of the critical conversations that we must have around dealing with corruption. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, you then answered the question I was about to ask next around how then do we make leadership about service, about the people, and not about self-enrichment. I think you did justice to that component. You know, the very last one, I promise, then we can open the floor. Let's because you have been talking about bits and pieces of the solution to our problem as a people. And if I got you correctly, if I'm to summarize all that you say, we can come back to the conclusion that no, the problem in Zimbabwe is deindustrialization. And that deindustrialization that has happened for the past 25 years, or actually more than 25 years. In earnest, deindustrialization started when the Zimbabwean dollar lost 70% of its value, I think on the 17th of November 1997, when they said in Shona, Doraradon, you know, when we were younger, we were saying Doraradon. In essence, the crash of the devaluation of the currency to date, Zimbabwe has never recovered competitively. So all I have noticed that if there's no industrialization or reindustrialization of Zimbabwe, then we can forget about becoming an upper middle income economy. We can forget about having people in employment with enough wages to then spend in that particular economy. So to talk about reindustrialization, what sectors then, in your opinion, should take charge in this reindustrialization of Zimbabwe in the context of what you're calling a developmental state model? Comrade Dostalo.
Thank you very much. I think there is a debate, Brother Mlambo, for economists in the country and beyond around the question of industrialization. And obviously those and in this now obviously joined by environmentalists, we are convinced, Brother Mlambo, that we have to industrialize. Their proposition around saying Zimbabwe must be a finance-based economy and stuff like that. We don't think that to resolve the crisis in our country, we must ignore the second industrial revolution. So our proposition, controversial to some as they would view it, particularly environmentalists, there is no single, and this is obviously a direct challenge to the Washington consensus, because the proposition by the neoliberal global order is that we must keep these stages of industrialization and go to services. But our proposition is that we have to industrialize. We have to build industries. To build industries, Brother Number, will entail the following. We have to invest in the energy sector. So the conversation about Wange, the conversation about Kariba are very minimalistic in the proposition of growing our economy, particularly through rapid industrialization. It will mean that we must continue mining coal. There is a recent debate in South Africa around the support by the American government, which was there previous during the Joe Biden administration, a bilateral agreement around South Africa stopping to mine coal. And progressive parties, of course, in the left opposed that proposition, because we must continue to mine coal so that we industrialize, because we would need massive energy. But we are not refusing the fact about looking at other sources of energy, for example, methane gas in Matabele North, particularly methane in Lupane. That's very important. Solar is important. And of course, the regional solution to the crisis. The Inga Dam project is an important proposition that we must look into because our people are too simplistic in resolving the energy crisis. So when we now talk about the Inga Dam project, it means that the leadership of SADC, the leadership of the African Union now, ought to be very interested in resolving the crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Because without peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Brother Mlam, it means we will not be able to harness the potential of the Democratic Republic of Congo Inga Dam project, which scholars suggests that an empirical research shows that it is a capacity of producing over 45,000 megawatts of electricity. So that's sufficient energy for the continent to industrialize. So a regional approach is going to be very important in our industrial program. But I must say this as an underlining factor that, Brother Lambo, if you study all countries that have developed, all advanced economies, without exception, so that we close the debate on whether we must take this route or not, you'd realize that all developed and advanced economies that have industrialized have done so with concerted industrial policies. So you cannot ignore that. That's what data shows. And you also have to understand that that industrial policy was anchored around the state leading and having an upgraded campaign where the government drives investment, where the government drives development in infrastructure in the key manufacturing sectors and developing human capital and training workers, because you cannot industrialize without investing in the bureaucracy of the state. If you look at the nature of people that work for the government in this country, they are tired. Shem. You can see when you go to Makombe, you can see the exhausted bureaucracy in our country, overworked and underpaid workers using analog systems. You get the point. So the effort that we propose is that the state must ensure that it develops a rapid industrial program and make sure that we provide the subsidies because we have to protect, but we also have to support local industries. The problem we have now with this knee-jerk approach is that the current establishment proposes that we must protect local industry, but we look at capacity utilization, then you realize that it's so oxymoronic because we are not producing, but we are then banning imports. The first thing is that you must produce. Once you know that your balance of payments are in order, you are producing, then you can go to the proposition. I mean, the future conversation must be, Brother Mlambo. For example, if we want to protect the textile industry, develop the entire value chain, you would agree with me that there will be no need. In fact, a serious government will have to ban second-hand clothes in Zimbabwe to protect the local industry. But you can't start there. You have to start by making sure that you rebuild Malin, you capacitate Malin, because if you go to Malin now, it's occupied by prophets, it's occupied by these fake high schools and so forth that Zimshare is dealt with. So you realize that there must be investment in state subsidizing local industries and also provision of loans to strategic local firms in our country. People ought to access loans so that they're able to produce and then contribute to the industrial program. So in short, I think the proposition is that we must have an industrial policy and we must make sure that the state leads the process. But it must be, as we defined philosophically and when we started, it must be a state that is led by honest, competent, and credible people. So it's important now because, as I said, the state that we're talking about that must lead development is not the state that exists ontologically in some imaginary world as a robot that is able to deal with human excesses. It is a state that is occupied by you and me. So we must ensure that the state is occupied by competent people. Let those who have experienced, Brother Mlambo, in Studio 263. Let them go there and develop the arts industry, which is a pivotal industry in our country. So you must ensure that the conversation that we must be investing about is not in the political, is in making sure that we have a competent bureaucracy, we have a capable bureaucracy that will drive the state. Because politicians will be going around cutting ribbons. What is more important is investment on capable men of women who can run the state as bureaucrats to lead this industrial program of action that we propose. I thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Comrade Ostalos. So you seem to be very clear on the role of state-led development, notwithstanding the ideological opposition that might come from many quarters around the role of the state in development. But I think you have managed to put your points across, what you believe in, that we cannot let go of the state. 2, the state should be developmental. 3, the state should be manned by men and women who are honest, credible, and competent. I think those are fair points to raise. Number 4, the important component again, the institutions of the state that are supposed to support industrialization or industrial development, financial sector, the rotations themselves, and I think it's an institution we inherited. The IDBZ, a colonial institution that was created after the unilateral declaration of independence, as a financial institution that provided what in development economics they call patient capital, patient capital, so that you can invest in strategic sectors of the economy, infant industries, give them cheap loans, cheap credit, cheap money, in essence. And I think it's called IDBZ. I think it's still around. I don't know whether how that links with the current Minister of Industry. Actually, the current minister is my namesake, Mangaliso Ngobizita Anjov. I wonder what he's doing there with industrial policy and stuff like that. So we do appreciate, Comrade Ostalos, you hammering on the need for a state that is developmental in nature. I think that's the ideological thrust, that the state should be a site for development, not a site for primitive accumulation. But I love the point you made earlier, that you said you are not of the view that the private sector is not going to play any role. I think you emphasized that. For those who might have fears around the state leading development, you indicated earlier on that no, the private sector, yes, we need capital from domestic sources and foreign sources, but that private sector should feed into that national vision that the developmental state will propose. So we appreciate what you've said, Comrade Ostalos. Wow. So I want to open up the platform. The question still is Zimbabwe, what is to be done in the context of development? We must not lose sight of our focus today in the context of how to develop this country. We have had enough of the problems, solutions, and years of the view that a developmental state model can work. So I've seen a lot of people have requested to speak, so I'll just pick one or two. Please firstly state your name and then be brief, right, in your question, right, to Comrade Ostalos. Comrade Ostalos, take note of the questions. I'll take the first 3. Please be brief so that we have as many, because I see we're over 400 here, so that we have as many who can interact with Comrade Ostalos. So I see Maziwa, sorry, not Masiza. Maziwa, I see Tatenda and Zuze. So can we start with Maziwa, then Zuze, then Tatenda? Go ahead.
Oh, yebo linjani.
Siyaphila nje.
Yaphila. My issue, okay. Okay, I was gonna engage with Ostalos about the employment rates and try and figure out how do you count the people that have never entered the workforce in Zimbabwe. But then, as he continued talking, I was like, no. all the things that you have said, the 7 pillars of the problems we have in Zimbabwe, we already know them. But the problem is we are not free. We are under oppression, coercion, suppression, everything. So how do we free ourselves so we can solve these problems? We need to free ourselves so we can solve these problems. So you, as one of the people that we consider as our leader, OSTALOS, senze njani, kwenziwani ngendaba yokuthi how do we get out of oppression so that we can solve these problems? The money being stolen, siyakwazi konke lokho. What do we do about our freedom? How do we free ourselves so we can tackle these 7 pillars that you have indicated? We already know that. Zimbabwean people already know these things. How do we free ourselves? That's the question I have for you. What's the plan to free ourselves? What's the plan to conscientize people on the ground on Section 52 of the Constitution? What we do, or what we do about that? Because once we have freed ourselves, we can solve any problem.
Thank you very much.
For you.
Siyabonga. Tête-à-tête. Zuze.
Yes, my brother, how are you?
I'm all right, thank you. You can go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, mine is a similar question to the one that has just been asked by my sister there. We might talk and discuss and have brilliant ideas, but we all know that Zimbabwe is a military state. First, we need to be free, then we can implement whatever we want. So still the question is, how do we free ourselves to implement whatever Mr. Ostalos is saying? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tatenda.
Thank you very much, Comrade Mambo. How are you, Comrade Gifty? My question is around, first of all, agriculture. We are talking a lot about agriculture, but we know that Africa cannot feed itself. There's competition in terms of GMOs, in terms of the big brands who are coming to suppress our agriculture, and then we are being fed from Europe. An example is the white community in South Africa. They are farming GMO maize and they are selling to Zimbabwe. Yellow maize being shipped corn right now from USA to South Africa and then being sold to Zimbabwe. So how are we going to solve these kind of issues around seed, around GMO, which seems to be a friction to developing our own agriculture? Second question is about minerals. We spoke about a lot, but this is the neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, the most dangerous. Public lectures. Guys, we need to educate our people to fight neo-colonialism. We all know what it is. I won't dwell much time. And then, obviously, we are talking development, but the politics comes first. How are we going to move forward with the political situation in Zimbabwe? The political calendar. I'm looking at the political calendar right now. When was the previous election? When is the next, if it happens? Preparedness, diaspora vote, the voters roll. What is going to happen? Can you say something around that? For the sake of time, I'll end here. Thank you.
Okay, Siyabonga. Very, very good questions. The first two were more or less similar, Comrade Ostalos. Then the question by Tatenda is on the seed sector. Just to indicate that, one of the companies that is doing well currently in Zimbabwe is Seedco, apparently. Amidst all the chaos that we have economically, it's one of the companies that is doing well. So you might want to look into Seedco and what they are doing to protect the seeds that we have, indigenous seeds and stuff like that. But you raise a very good point around the use of GMOs and stuff. So, Comrade Ostalos, over to you. The 3 questions. I mean, there are 2 because essentially the first 2 questions were on the politics, and then the last one was on seeds, African trade, and stuff like that. Over to you as we prepare for other people to speak.
No, thank you very much, Brother Mlambo. I mean, I see that most of the people want us to answer the simple and black and white question, which is the political question. How do we solve the crisis in our country? It's a question that we engage ourselves every day, particularly as a political movement. But we felt that it's important to hold a space and have a look into the conversation that we avoid as a nation. The conversation about what kind of a society do we have to build if we are to resolve the political impasse that we face as a people. The political crisis in Zimbabwe has obviously been taken decades to resolve. For us in the democratic opposition, more than 2 decades, almost 3 decades now, in the trenches fighting for democracy in our country. And many people are convinced that the struggle has taken too long. The only thing is that the intention of this space was not centered around the resolution of the political crisis in the country, which we speak about, particularly in the opposition political alternative movement, which we are part of, to unpack how we intend to resolve the political question in the country. I think that the following issues are critical if I'm to answer clearly this question. The first and foremost thing is obviously that there has to be a change of government. That is the first and most fundamental that all of us in our day-to-day work as political leaders and activists are involved in, is the question of ensuring that there ought to be a change of government. But today we're taking a step further to say, because that's the big question that any right-thinking person want to know, to say, you remove ZANU-PF and then what? That is the conversation today. You want to have a change of government to replace ZANU with ZANU-PF, or you replace ZANU with ZANU-PF light. So that's why there must be investment in this important intellectual labor and characterization of the crisis and the nature of the state that ought to govern Zimbabwe beyond ZANU-PF. And that's what is important, particularly, yes, for activists and people and thought leaders within the democratic opposition in the country. Because that conversation should not be at all times be shelved under the carpet. And that's what we intend to unpack in the Tête-à-tête, to look into the character and content of the state that must take over the country beyond ZANU-PF. So the solution to Zimbabwean question political is obviously the change of government. To change government now, there are so many qualitative and quantitative factors. The first that someone indirectly asked is to say, what is the role of the opposition? So I'm going to answer the question on the role of the opposition. Our role. Now I'm wearing the gown of the democratic alternative to speak on behalf of the movement. And then I'm going to touch on the role of the citizen. So there are two fundamental issues. And then the role of those who are within the state. So the first role is that we must, as the democratic opposition, we left the Triple C. The Triple C is no longer a credible vehicle to take us forward. So what we are seized with at the present moment is building a credible alternative. We must build a stronger institution. What is the role of this organization? What is the role of this movement? The first one is to push back on the consolidation of authoritarianism. That's why we have unequivocally rejected and refused to be part and parcel of the twerking class of 2030. So we have to push back. That's why any right-thinking and credible political actor in this country ought to reject the attempt by the current establishment to amputate the constitution and give Mr. Mnangagwa a 30 term. That is the first thing. So our role is going to be pushing back. So you're going to be seeing us in different ways, method, forms, and capacities, pushing back on this 2030 agenda as the first point of entry in pushing back on authoritarian consolidation. The second thing is to ensure that now, beyond pushing back, we have to make sure that we protect our own movement. We know the yesteryear problems of the CCC, the MDC, and its virus formations. We ought to build a strong organization, a movement that we know that is going to be protected by different means and methods that obviously I can speak of at the present moment. Thirdly, the credibility of the organization is important. So we are now talking about policy and our proposition. Every Zimbabwean ought to know what a Chamisa-led democratic movement is going to bring in terms of our path to transformation. And the last, we have to resist dictatorship. We have to resist dictatorship. The current establishment must be resisted. That's our role now, as I'm speaking on behalf of the democratic opposition. So our program of action by the youth, by the women, and the main organs of our movement are going to be centered around resisting a dictatorship. And then, so those are the key 4 roles of the democratic alternative. And that's what the current processes that are happening are building towards. Someone talked about calendars based on the election and stuff like that. I hope it answers the question that the movement ought to be ready to participate in the processes, the political processes in the country. Now, what is the role of the ordinary citizen? The one who asked me, that is Uma Pepe, my brother Zuze, they asked me a critical question. We must deal with the fear that is emasculated Zimbabwean citizens, because we ought to understand that the freedom of our country is not going to come through political elites. The freedom of our nation is going to come through the concerted efforts of us as Zimbabweans. So I've got a role that I play in the political movement, but I have a role that I play as an ordinary Zimbabwean. Zimbabweans are emasculated and captured by fear. If you want to see that, walk into the streets of Harare and want to execute street action as an example. You realize that only us political activists are going to be in and out of prisons because the state has managed to separate political activists and ordinary Zimbabwean, and therefore killing citizen agents in our country. Zimbabweans can't question anything. So that's why people can still take spares money, and we get convinced that it is the role of an individual political leader to resolve that. So while the political movement ought to confront the questions of the day and make sure that they resist and organize citizens, which is our role as a movement, we ought to converse about citizen agents and the role of ordinary Zimbabweans to speak out when you see that someone has stolen public funds, when we see that there's no electricity in our homes, when we see that there's no water in the tap. The basic citizen agents in our country was entirely destroyed by ZANU's investment in fear and terror for the past 4 decades. That's why you see that most people that speak out in Zimbabwe are in the diaspora. And when you characterize the events of what happened on the 31st of March, it tells you the story of how Zimbabweans participate in civilian and political affairs. The default
Comrade Ostalos.
thinking, let me summarize, Brother Mlam. The
Okay.
default thinking by an ordinary Zimbabweans is that I would rather stay in home than to exercise my constitutional guaranteed right to protest. That is the nature of the problem in our country. Lastly, it is the role of those that are neither within the democratic spaces and neither ordinary people. The decisive power block in our country ought to realize that the problems in this country are beyond the political formations and political parties. And that's why it is important at this present moment that the conversation must be centered around convergence to resolve the political crisis in our country. Progressive Zimbabweans, right-thinking Zimbabweans, regardless of their political affiliations, ought to converge and open the future whom the present is holding in suffocation. I thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Ostalos. Wow. I knew that the moment we open up for questions, the question around politics and what is to be done in the context of politics will naturally emerge. But as you said, I think you did justice. or on the seed question, maybe just to make a brief intervention on the comrade who asked about seeds and the use of GMOs. It all comes back to the nature of the trade agreements that our African governments are getting into. So that's why I think when OSTALOS was speaking earlier, when he said the industrialization we are talking about is not only the industrialization of Zimbabwe, but should be the industrialization from Cape to Cairo. Because once you have robust economies, well-developed economies, even when you negotiate, you're in a better position to determine the kind of food your people are going to eat. There's a very, very dangerous trend with GMOs that you mentioned, and I've seen some advocacy by some Zimbabweans around the stopping of GMO foods to be imported into our country. But if your people are hungry, you remember Cabinet Secretary Comrade OSTALOS, I think 3-4 months ago, that said 7.7 million Zimbabweans are food insecure, of which 4.5 million are school-going children who are in need of food at schools. So if the state cannot provide that food from the produce of local farmers, if our agricultural sector is weak, we become vulnerable to the import. I hope it makes sense, to the importation of genetically modified foods and seeds that will affect our health in the long term. The question around raising agricultural productivity, and I think it's actually a sad thing that 25 or 26 years after the first land reform program, we have not managed to invest massive in the infrastructure necessary to harvest the little rain that we are getting, so that we have agriculture 365 days a year, which we control as a country. So it's a question of domestic policies, but regional policy at SADC level, as well as at African Union level. It's a problem that Zimbabwe alone cannot address. There should be a concerted continental response to that, comrade. In the interest of time, I want to invite another set. Please, can we try to? I know it's not easy because of the stature of OSTALOS in the politics of the country, but can we try to confine the questions to the developmental state that is proposing as an alternative model? I know there are a lot of questions around, what should we do? I think he's managed to answer on what needs to be done politically. Can we interact with the content on the economy and the developmental alternative that he is proposing? Please. So I want to balance, and I'll pick, since we had 2 gentlemen previously and a lady, I'll pick 2 ladies now. I see Ruwimbo, Maboko, I see Denford, in that order, and last but not least, Ndumiso. Those 4, please, in that particular order: Ruwimbo, Maboko, Ndumiso, Denford. Can we have those 4, please, and be brief if you can? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the space and for taking time to come and talk to us. I just had a very quick question around trust. So one of the key things that I've been noticing, especially in this political, even in the advocacy space, specific young people, there is definitely a trust that has been broken over the years. There is a toxic culture that we have in the political space that means that young people just distance themselves when we need them the most. So how do we begin to repair trust if we want, especially those young people, to come on board?
Thanks very much, Ruwimbo. Short and precise. Next in order.
Thank you, Visitor. OSTALOS Nyakubingelela. I want to speak as a fellow diasporan, OSTALOS. I think especially when you touch on how much financial injection the diaspora brings ekhaya. Perhaps I represent a demographic of people who continuously fear the reliance of how much we bring into the country, especially when you consider the times that we're in right now with, I don't know, let me just use the Trump-China tariff argument, the US aid situation. These are some of the things that even are impacting diaspora pocket, to the extent that I'm not even sure that some of us, if not all of us, will be able to continuously inject money into Zimbabwe the way that we used to. And I think this is something that really Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe need to think long and hard about this reliance on a big brother diaspora injection. So I don't know if you can touch on other ways that the diaspora can help, because the reason why I say that is obviously the financial situation, and two, we know for a very long time we are not going to get the diaspora vote. We've seen our chief even come to the diaspora to try and help with this, and this hasn't gone anywhere. And I feel like it's something that needs to be looked at properly in terms of how our opposition leaders are helping Zimbabweans. One of the things that I'm also not very clear about, Ostalos, if you can help me with it, is that I don't know whether it's my naivety, but I've always believed that a government does well by the way it looks after its poor. And we always have this anticipation as diaspora that if we want change, we will see that change brought about by our opposition leaders. But there seems to be something that cripples our opposition parties. We only see them when it comes to election, but to actively move or be in coalition with the people there seems to be such a gap, whether either the people are expected to lead and then the opposition follow. It's very blurred, and I really would like an honest answer from someone who's in the opposition to tell us as a people, even in the diaspora, what is crippling them. Are they gripped by the same fear that grips the community, for us to sort of think maybe there isn't a leader right now and we should wait for God to provide another one in the future? I think those are some of the things that I really want you to touch on, Ostalos, especially when you speak about socialism. I think coalition with citizens comes into play with that. We're very clear on what the ZANU relationship is with the citizens, but it seems in the past couple of years, we have a very blurred relationship between opposition and the citizens. And we really need to understand what is the problem, opposition leaders. How can we help? We know our pockets are going to run dry before 2030 if things continue the way that they are in the Western world. So I'll stop there for now. But there's so many things I wanted to touch on about when you spoke about the informal sector as well, Ostalos. Many of our relatives now are employed in the informal sectors. They're either now housemaids, gardeners, or makorokozas and all of that. But the thing is, these are problems that we already know. We just need people like yourselves who are now in positions to help us think out on what is problematic with the processes, what is problematic with the people in high positions. Should you guys be helping us sack people, or should you guys be helping us change the processes? So there are many questions that I have, but I feel like we need to open our eyes a bit wider to some of these issues. Thank you.
Siyabonga. James.
Thank you, co-host, and thank you to Comrade Ostalos. I want to quickly say that thank you very much for giving us this opportunity and bringing out very important developmental issues in our country, Zimbabwe. Initoda kuti nditaure chinhu zvishoma or one chekuti maybe our co-host have said we need to center our questions mainly on what the topic is all about. But I think the main reason why you will find I should not be the last person who will be centering their questions on politics is much to do with miscommunication within our opposition. What has to happen, and what I think has to happen, is the reason why people are going to be speaking about some of the things that you would say mustn't speak. It's because they actually presume that we have been given an opportunity to speak out, and some of the things that we could not speak out, or the information that we are not being given, let's actually have it here. So I don't think you will be doing us favor by not letting, in as much as it's a topic, a different topic altogether, but people will say it's an opportunity that we need to speak out, because one, we are not being informed. Secondly, the people in the leadership, they are, especially on our opposition, we know the credible opposition. It's you guys, it's our president Nelson Chamisa, and sometimes we will say we are going off topic. It's mainly because we do not have a way of communication from you guys. So my issue here is, Comrade Ostalos, I think it's important that you need to have makashanda communications. A quick example is that of what happened on the 31st of March. People became headless. Why? Because there wasn't any information coming from you guys. Even today, I don't know if you are going to be telling us what we could have done or what is going to be happening in the near future. Our economics is going to be okay if our politics is going to be all right. So I just implore you, if our president is listening, if you are going to be relaying information, I think what I'm saying is could be what a lot of Zimbabweans are saying. And lastly, I think most Zimbabweans are slowly but surely losing faith in what I suppose is the credible opposition in Zimbabwe. So we need to be very careful. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I understand. Comrade Ostalos.
No, thank you very much, Brother Mlambo. I think that I'll quickly respond to the questions. First one was from my sister, there, Maboko. Thank you very much, my sister. I think that some of it obviously were proper. That's the importance of these conversations. Obviously, today was the beginning of this series so that we are able to propose and have interventions from citizens like you have done. Because as you are doing that, we are also taking notes because it's a two-way process for us to have the thinking of Zimbabweans and progressive minds in terms of how do we rescue our country. So the question on self-sufficiency is important. We can't continue depending on diaspora remittances. That's why the state-led agenda resolve the question of our self-sufficiency as a nation. That's what we are proposing, that the state must take care of its audit. That's the primary duty of the government, to take care of the ordinary people, and in philosophical terms, as you have put it, to take care of the downtrodden, because that's the role of the state, to balance between the private sector and the historically disadvantaged ordinary citizen by redistributing wealth for the benefit of ordinary people. That's what we were speaking about in the first session of our proposition. Then there was a question from my brother. I think that the two questions were no. Ru asked a question around how to resolve toxicity. Our country is sharply divided. That's why we think part of our contribution as the democratic alternative and right thinking Zimbabweans is to begin to have a conversation around critical issues that affect our country and to be able to begin to propose solutions beyond binary politics that we are part of in our daily lives. We go to rallies, we draw the line between ZANU and the democratic opposition. And that division moves from the state down into the family level. That is the problem of our country, and I think that is a world problem. Those elders that we've been speaking to are telling us that there is that spirit of division that has entered the world. I'm not someone who's very spiritual, but there is a deep understanding that we must cure and deal with the divisions that are in our society. You look at the spaces that Zimbabweans host, sometimes people end up insulting each other. You look at the divisions in communities. Our country has been dragged into being closer to Rwanda in 19 because of the challenges of division, the toxicity. So people, even in workplaces, people who are not political, are facing these challenges. So I think that the solution is beginning to, as responsible political leaders, to begin conversation around reculturing our country into discourse that does not look at personalities, that does not look at what has been dividing us, and focusing on what we should do. That's what I think is important. Particularly when I say this, I'm talking about the progressive family. I'm not talking about those that are responsible for the misery of our country, because some might hijack and talk about the unity with those that have destroyed our country. We are talking about the conversation and the progressive convergence of the progressive forces, and not with those that have bastardized and destroyed our country. The last question, I think, yes, my brother, thank you very much. It's a contribution. We would allow citizens to contribute and say whatever they view, like like you have said, in the context that there are limited conversations. We are definitely going to have another space where myself and other political leaders within the democratic opposition are going to be coming to speak particularly about the state of the democratic opposition and the way forward. But that's the space that was scheduled for the third conversation from this one. So I think that is a clear reflection. That is a more urgent question, and it must be resolved and would allow citizens to express themselves in terms of them getting questions around the democratic. There are propositions, of course, for our return into the communications department to ensure that the democratic opposition can begin to inform citizens in a very periodical way, and all the conversations are in the pipeline. And of course, making sure that the credible movement comes into play and be able to respond to the political questions of our time, particularly the major question of making sure that we resist tyranny. Some of us are ready, and we have expressed this conversation within the rank and file of the democratic opposition, so that we're able to confront the challenges, the political challenges of our country at the moment, and ensure that they are resolved permanently, and we've got a change of government in our country. So we are very clear, and the conversations happening in the country inform that discourse. But of course, we're going to have the leadership collective and the principal at the right time coming to converse with citizens around the way forward for the democratic opposition. I thank you.
All right. Thanks, Comrade Ostalos. My assumption is people have been answered. Ndumiso, sorry, I'd forgotten that you're on the list. So I'll start with Ndumiso, Praise Kulani Moyo, Madube, in that order.
There's also Ralph.
And Ralph. Sorry about that. So Ndumiso, Ralph, Praise Kulani Moyo, and Madube. The four of you. While Ndumiso is connecting, can if Ralph you're ready, you can go ahead. I think Ralph, the mayor of Kariba, you can go ahead.
Thanks, comrade. I hope I'm clear.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, sure. I will not dwell much on the other questions because obviously change is coming. But I think I need to also just probably get an idea of one critical issue as we look into the future, and which is the issue of social security nets. Comrade Ostalos, we will obviously agree that one of the critical questions that led the labor movement into transforming into a political movement was the erosion of social security nets and the erosion of the safety of both the workers and the poor. I would want to understand, as the alternative takes over, what is the strategy to restore meaningful social security nets that will also speak into an economy that is driven by the state and still makes sense to the citizens. We agreed with the situation, Comrade Ostalos, where a lot of people, I think people that were working between the period of 1990 and 2015, those people had probably their pensions eroded twice or thrice. We had people that lost whatever investment they put in medical insurance, health insurance, and so forth. And we don't have a clear structure right now in the context of this chaotic government. What would be the strategy? Because this is a very important area if we are to then develop an economy that is driven by the state in a holistic manner. So I think I would really want to understand and appreciate what you think around that area.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Praise Kulanmoy.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased and thank you for affording me this chance. But I want to weigh in on something that is very important that I've realized through this conversation. And in addressing the issue of development, you and I know that the world is moving very, very fast, and we are lagging behind as Africa in general and Zimbabwe in particular. I want to, for example, weigh in on a question where some contributor here said GMOs are flocking or are trickling into the country, and it's a burden. It's now a burden for us and all that. But we should appreciate that moving forward as Zimbabwe, if ever we are to develop, we must be in touch with science, technology, modern engineering, and so on, because these utterances like GMOs are a danger, they belong to ZANU-PF, they belong to historic, archaic movements, backward movements like ZANU-PF, which do not appreciate that even today, the World Health Organization, the American Medical Society, and you have publicly said that there is no harm in these GMOs. And we have food security issues in Zimbabwe, and we are there joining the bandwagon of old, tired rhetoric that doesn't work. So we have a problem now, even in accepting technology, even in other areas, besides this GMO issue, because we are guided by rumors, we are guided by fear of the unknown, and this is really a drawback to the progress of this country. So I just want to state that in moving forward, we should embrace technology, and some of these things that we see in government are simply because, for example, we have failed to digitalize, we have failed to do a lot of things because we do not embrace technology. So in a nutshell, I want to conclude by saying, let's value science as we look forward to this democratic developmental state that we all envision. Thank you.
Thank you. Praise Kulan Moyo. Matt Dube.
Hi, Ngubisita. Hi, OSTALOS. I think my question is on as you laid out the plan for this developmental state, a lot of those goals seemed like long-term goals. So I'm trying to avoid touching on the politics, but the question becomes, will you put in place a sort of a transitional policy regime before you move on to that? Because I think if you underestimate the problems that we face as a country, then you are loading you are putting on the new government or whatever will come is something that will not realistically materialize. So I think my question is around between that place where we're saying now we're developing, now we are putting up this in mining, we are putting up this in this. How has there been any thought or any policy formulation around that transitional period? How are you going to get capital back into the country to restart those industries? What are you looking at? You speak of brain drain. Is our education even aligned to what we need for the future state, for this future developmental state? Investment, where is you spoke about mining being you went into mining and whatever's going to happen with it, it takes a lot of money. How is that going to be done? How is this state going to look at already like people that are already in Zimbabwe mining and extracting and doing that, those agreements with countries like China, how are those going to be dealt with? We talk about we will have these policies that will allow for certain things. But what is the transitional framework from the current policy situation to the next one? What is the economic framework from the current to the next one? So all these things will need a bridge on which to be built. And I worry that a lot of incoming young, happy governments never consider those things and therefore go into something that they are not ready to deal with. So the first thing would be looking at that. How do we transition from A to B? How do we deal with corruption as it is? What policies, what measures, what will be put in place to make sure a developmental government is a very government, hands-on, intense government? How will you protect Zimbabwe from that developmental government becoming the exactly the same kind of government that this one we have now is? Because it has a lot of power in policy, in investment, in this, in that. How are you going to protect the? So there seems to be a missing link on my end, and that's what I wanted to find out about, without going into the politics, which I want to. But yeah, thanks.
Siyabonga, but yeah, fantastic questions actually. Actually, they are political.
Yeah, powerful. Yeah.
Very powerful. Ndumiso, before Comrade Ostalos comes in, Ndumiso, are you ready? If not, we will come in the next round. Comrade Ostalos, can you address the submissions made by the mayor, by Kulani Moyo, and lastly by Madube? If you can, try to be brief as you can.
Thank you. It's difficult to be brief, Brother Mlambo, because citizens want answers. And I think that I'll quickly summarize so that we take maybe the last round and close for the day. We are going to have other Tête-à-tête. Remember, it's a weekly program to unpack some of these issues. I think praise raises a debate that we talked about in the first segment of the session around balancing between technology, culture, innovation, and science. When he introduces the subject of GMOs and the conversations, I think that there's there's a thin line between what citizens imagine as GMOs and fake products in the market and stuff like that. So it's a broad conversation that we talked about when we talked about protection of local industries and making sure that there's quality control. That's the role of state institutions that we're talking about in the industrialization program, because issues around inspection, issues around processes, issues around laws. So if someone is doing production of a certain product, there are certain laws and standards. The only thing is that obviously in a bastardized economy and the challenges that we face, institutions like the Standard Association of Zimbabwe are almost defunct and challenge the role of Zimbra, and the corruption within that sector plays a very big role. So that's why we talk about reform and reimagination of these institutions and the sector, so that people are able to embrace science and at the same time understand the importance of quality and serving future generations. Then there was a question by my brother Ralph, a very important question that probably would need Brother Mlambo. One of the Tête-à-têtes must look at the question around social service in our country and social safety nets, because NASA is a big issue in our country, and the erosion of pensioners. My father personally was a pensioner, and something that I'm very passionate about. I think that what should happen to NASA is that we must start with audit of NASA. There must be a relook, and compensation is going to be a very critical issue of the future government to look into. People ought to be compensated And of course, audit is going to be very key into NASA, how people lost their monies and how these monies were used to fund politically collected elites and funding girlfriends of political elites. There was the other question that made me very nostalgic from my sister. The question around the transitional period. I think when we touched a bit on the financial sector, we highlighted that in the economy, there's the macroeconomic framework and program, but there is the microeconomic in the economic sector. We ought, where we talk about the transitional microeconomic framework, like quick currency reform, for example, using the US dollar in the interim, because the macroeconomic currency program is going to be talking about bringing back the Zimbabwean dollar, right? But in the interim and the transitional period, we have to have us obviously using the US dollar, but definitely not as a long term. And I know that I know Mdaraji is here is going to speak briefly on the issue of the currency as an economist. So that's the microeconomic framework and the transitional period. And I must acknowledge something. The reason why I was very nostalgic, my sister, is because when we talk about resolving corruption issue, there are transitional issues that are going to be very critical. Issues around amnesty are transitional questions. Issues around forgiveness, in the issue around resolving some of the past conflicts in the country, issues around reparations, issues around truth telling are transitional questions. Very murky waters, but very interesting, conversation. And I must acknowledge, as a way also to respond to that question, that while we put forward these macroeconomic frameworks, fundamentals, and propositions, we are conscious of the mess that our country is finding itself in. That a Chamisa-led government is going to inherit a mess. And one of the most important things that we've conversed about internally within the democratic movement is how our country is going to need a very strong leader. This country is going to need a very strong leader, a very firm. We're not talking about dictatorship and fascism. We're talking about firmness. We're talking about the ability to confront some of the challenges. We had a conversation with the government of Zambia, led by Hichilema, the extent of undeclared debt that they realize with the Chinese government and so forth, to the extent that President Hichilema had to fly and meet Xi Jinping in Beijing to resolve some of these issues. So the under declaring of the debt in the country, we know that we are going to be inheriting a mess, and we are conscious about this, and we hope that we remain conscious about these realities. Most of this discourse is far from the public discourse, but it is the extent of our investment in understanding the nature of what we are going to be inheriting and how we ought to resolve these issues, um, 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 and to ensure that citizens are with the government in understanding how these questions are going to be answered, particularly when President Chamisa takes over government. I think that Brother Mlambo have answered. Maybe we can take the last few questions, and we've taken so much of the people's time, so that we I see Daraji is itching to speak, but I'll hand over to you, Mlambo, so that can take a few, and then we are able to close this space. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Gift. Comrade Ostalos, thanks so much for the responses. Ndumiso Taona Denere, I think. Ndumiso Taona Denere, I see Alois Banye. Alois Rebel. I'm just saying in that order so that everyone gets a chance to speak. So Ndumiso, get ready to speak. Taona, get ready to speak. Koma Taona, get ready to speak. Alois, get ready to speak. Mudara, someone with the name Mudara G, get ready to speak. I don't know if I've left anyone. Vandenda as well. Tabani, Swanda, Tabani, get ready to speak. I'm just trying to pick a few so that we try and conclude. And we'll see whether we have time. So if you have spoken, can you just drop off so that I see it was quite overwhelming. A lot of people are just sending in requests. So Ndumiso, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate what you guys are trying to do here, but I think it's misplaced, and I'll say my reasons why. The first question would be, why are you having this exercise, especially as you touted yourself as a political scientist, and then you are here talking to us about dealing with symptoms of oppression, not the problem, but the issues that are as a result of the problem. So basically, we are to spend the next 4 or 5 hours sitting here discussing issues that are a result of oppression instead of dealing with the oppression itself. So basically, we are dreaming. That's how I see it.
It's okay. So in the interest of time, because that question has been answered.
No.
It
was rhetorical. So
what's your question?
Okay. As I've already stated what my feelings are with regards to this exercise, I think also you misadvertised because you said what needs to be done. You didn't say development. So now, while that we are here, we're now saying no development. So, gentlemen, as our political leaders, I would suggest that you are upfront with the people to start with. You provide solutions according to your expertise. Because we cannot sit here listening to a political scientist actually playing politics with us. That's the reality.
Thank you very much. I would ask, but in the interest of time, when we said what is to be Zimbabwe, what is to be done, and we spoke about the developmental state, that's what needs to be done, just to put the things on record. What needs to be done is not necessarily what you might think needs to be done. Can I have Taona Denere, then Mudara G, then we can close, then we'll have Ostalos respond. So Taona Denere, you can go ahead. If you are not ready, Mudara G, you can go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. I would like to answer the gentleman that is just spoken and say that I think this is phenomenal in that the alternative is seeking to engage citizens. And this is the first step that the alternative is taking to engage people. Obviously, on the first engagement, there might be hitches here and there. People will ask, but I think we'll develop as we go on. This is phenomenal. No other political party, opposition, ruling or other, has engaged people at this level. But my talk is based on the we are in a deep mess. The deep mess has been created by this regime for a very long time. The banking system is fragile to the extent that there's only 2 banks that have any positive financial balances. I'm talking in terms of United States dollar reserves, and that is EcoBank and Stanbic. What happened in the past years is a repeated looting of foreign reserves, and these foreign reserves have been looted in different ways. You remember the auction, you remember the Bacchus, you remember the auction that has just ended recently. All that fixed at some point. The corruption that is around the country is alarming. We wanted something like 4.5 billion to obtain the local currency, the ZiG, but there's been deception. And in the process, the depletion of our gold reserves is alarming, and that continues. And the alternative will be coming to the people to see how best we can do it. I know I could.
Maybe we can have the next speaker. Komaji seems to be having problems on his network.
Having challenges. Yeah. Let's just have the last two because in the interest of time, so that we have time. So Tabani, Alois, in that order. If Tabani Svand, are you ready? If not,
Yeah,
Alois. Okay.
yeah. Hello, Mr. Ostalos. Hello, Pratam Lango. This is Chaban Swanda from Kweru. Yeah, guys, I think my brother Ostalos ukhulumile lapha ngokuthi siyaba about our economy. Sabe sikwazi ukuthi so and so they are affecting us. Like I'm able to drop some names like Wignochivayo is spending taxpayers' money, and we know that he is doing that. We have this guy is Kotisa Juanya and so on. And then what we need is the solution to stop those people to do what they are doing. You see, so the only way to confront them is to go to the street. You see. Then there is this day which was put. We don't know the connection between our movement and the person who was calling what he was calling us to do on the 31st. And so what we wanted, guys, is lina Ostalos lalimele lisitshela ukuthi simele sihambe yini or siyekele, yabo. Owenza ukuthi thina siyekele is because you didn't communicate. We're not going to involve ourselves entweni esingakwaziyo ukuthi lina li-involved. You see, so the proper communication was supposed to be made. And kulo muntu okhulumileyo lapho wathi we are until now asikwazi ukuthi what was your position, what was the position of the president, and what was your position, guys. Thina silandela li lalimele sitshela ukuthi lingahambi or hamba nini. You see, if you say, guys, you are controlling a large number, whereby ingabe lathi hamba nini, you was going to see some wonders. You see, but the problem is that we acted on assumption that if Wako involved or Fatima area they are not involved, then where are we going? You see, thank you very much.
Tabani. Alois.
Okay, thank you so much, Comrade Ostalos. Thank you for having us here. This is Alois Stellenbosch University. I just wanted to have a clarity, maybe if you can clarify. Let's say we have a new government in terms of pushing development further. Which route are we going to take? The old westernization route to development or the Arabic system? You can see that there are some Arab nations who are doing very well, or we are going to follow the Asian tiger route. The Asian tiger, we'll talk about your Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. So, because Mr. Ostalos, you said we must have sanity in our system in terms of economics, in terms of environment, in every part of our country. We need sanity. We need to do away with the old systems. So, between those three routes to development, which route do you think will be best for the new Zimbabwe? Or are we going to go the developmental authoritarian way? Can you clarify that between those routes? Which route do you think will be perfect for the new Zimbabwe to development fast? Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Rebel, I think you'll be the last one. Rebel.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just a summary of questions, and you can sum it up into one. The first question is, Ostalos, who are you presenting these ideas as? Who are you coming to us as? And just to conclude on that is, are you aware of the fact that Zimbabweans are literally dying right now under this destruction of ZANU? Our country is under threat. Institutions, everything is being captured. And you're coming to us talking about beneficiation and all these things. Are you aware of how Zimbabweans are living right now? Do you really understand where we are as a nation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Comrade Stalos, it seems like we'll need another one next week. But try to respond to what has been asked by, I think, 4 or 5 people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Mambo. Thank you very much, fellow citizens, for quite an engaging conversation around the crisis in our country. I think that we cannot overemphasize the conversation around. I think those that have followed Tête-à-tête know that our investment is on making sure that we bring the necessary proposition around how we have to rescue our country. We have so many programs that we do to talk about the politics of our country and to talk about the political solutions thereof, particularly on behalf of the democratic opposition, as led by President Chamisa, in terms of what we think should be done politically. But I know that it's an evergreen subject that probably will not be exhausted, and citizens continue to need the conversation. It's a clear sign, Brother Mlambo, that the space that had been set as the third to come after the second one has to be reversed to be the second one. So where we bring the political leadership of the democratic opposition to talk about the political situation in the country and the propositions by the democratic movement and the program of action that has been lined up from the alternative movement. I think that citizens are more interested in that, but I know that it's important, and I must emphasize that it's important that as we look at into the hardcore political questions in our country, we must also look at about the critical thought leadership questions, because we don't want to cross over and then face problems again and then have another period of people protesting and so forth, because we would not have invested in conversations around the nature of the state. Because my brother, Alois, I'm not so sure if you were there in the beginning of the conversation, where we tried to philosophize our proposition is that we must have a state-led development. Basically, it means that our proposition is that we must have a democratic developmental state where the state plays a critical role in development. So naturally, by taking that, it means that our ideological inclination will be informed by center-left social democratic values, meaning that we'll be taking a leaf from the countries like the Asian tigers, Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, and of course the experiences of countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, particularly in resolving the welfare issues that the mayor of Karibau, Ralph, was talking about. So that's basically the nature, character, and content of the state and its ideological underpinning. So you realize that when we talk about the democratic developmental state, we add an important phrase around the need for it to have the Zimbabwean characteristics. What it means is that China talks about practicing capitalism with Chinese characteristics is because China realized that it has to embrace some elements of capitalism, even if it is a cohesive authoritarian state. It knew that it has to grow the industry, so it has to liberalize the economy to a certain extent to allow investment to trickle in, and of course to ensure that it takes some investment. So So that's the conversation, but we started with that. And then there was a question from my brother, Rebel. Rebel, I think, in fact, I'll go, the question by Rebel comes, is also the same question by, I think it was Ndumiso. I understand the frustration of my brother Ndumiso. I hold the same frustration as an ordinary Zimbabwean because we are convinced that no one deserves the kind of suffering that Zimbabweans are going through. And that's why we are in and out of the course. And I must hasten to say that the reason why we do what we do as the democratic opposition, because we are convinced that we ought to fight and we have to be in the front line of fighting for freedom and democracy in our country. It's not an easy political terrain. Basically, the country's constitution is suspended. Freedom of assembly in this country has long been suspended. The Triple C as a party before it was captured, it was banned. So opposition, genuine opposition in politics in our country has been banned. But we continue to organize citizens. We continue to gather because we know that we have to push back. So we can't just follow dictates of police officers that take instructions from political elites who are our competitors. It's part of the fight. It's part of the journey. That's why we're engaged in this struggle, because we're fighting for freedom. And we know that it's not an easy walk in the path. My brother Rebel asked about, obviously, I come to the Tête-à-tête because I'm an ordinary citizen. And Tête-à-tête is a platform for us to bring solutions to the political conversations that we're engaged with in our country every day. That is the purpose of the Tête-à-tête, to be able to propose some of the solutions so that we also don't have a rust in the political conversations of how we want to resolve the crisis in our country. It doesn't mean that we are not making urgent the political questions which we assist with in our daily life. That's what we do every day to fight authoritarianism and resist dictatorship. So we understand the urgency of the political situation in the country. I stay in the ghetto. I'm recording this Twitter space from Chavala. That's where I stay. I stay in the ghetto. I understand the material conditions of the people. Even my own material condition are part of the motivating factors why we ought to fight. Because none of us, with the investment that was done by our parents and those that supported us to go to school, deserve to live the life that we are living. I don't think that we are getting what we're supposed to be getting as people have invested in our education and invested in our capacities as ordinary Zimbabweans, as young people and progressive citizens of our country. No one deserves the lives that all of us are living, because we have no, those of us who have no access to the feeding trough understand the nature of this crisis at a personal level. And because we have resisted trinkets and trappings of power, that's why we're living the life that we are living today. My brother, I think Taban, had raised a question from Gweru, if I'm not mistaken, it was Taban, my brother from Gweru. I think you are emphasizing the extent of the urgency of the political crisis that we're facing, but more importantly, because your contribution appeals directly to my conscience, because it speaks about the political responsibility that is in our shoulders as a leadership collective of the democratic opposition. And I'm happy that some of the people within the rank and file of the democratic alternative are here, because your contribution does not speak about more about our responsibility, but more to do with the urgency of the question and what, as a leadership collective, ought to do. You touch about the extent to which we would have signaled to respond to some of the political questions in our country in respect of August 31. And it really appeals to my conscience, because it's a genuine and authentic worry by an ordinary Zimbabwean around how we ought to advance the fight for dictatorship in our country. So uh, it's a very important question, and I think that those of us within the rank and file of the democratic opposition will take that question very seriously, and of course to be able to engage in some of the programs that are happening now in preparation of the new political vehicle, or to understand the time factor, but more importantly, there is responsibility that is in our shoulders, Brother Mlambo, as a leadership collective, to urgently resolve some of the political questions in our country. Probably it is the reason why probably Rebel was also raising these seemingly radical questions around, the role of the democratic opposition. It's a very, uh, partly a very personal question to me as someone who participates in the political processes in our country, and to the extent of which Zimbabwean citizens want these questions to be resolved by any means necessary or unnecessary, as I get it from other people. And it's an important point of reflection as we reflect around the way forward. I think that Brother Mlambo have answered some of the questions to the best of my ability. Fellow Zimbabweans, thank you very much for participating in the conversation. The future, in as much as this is political, is also technical. That's why we ought to invest in these conversations around how we are going to resolve these issues, because I don't think that people should govern when they don't understand what it will mean to govern a Zimbabwean state in its current status. So it's important to always invest in the conversations around how we are going to turn around the economy, how we are going to transform our country. So it's while it's that we have to resolve the urgent political question, that urgent political question is change. That urgent political question is the removal of ZANU-PF and ZANUism as a culture, and bringing in new politics, new culture, a new political system, and a new ideological anchor, as some of us are convinced. So that is the most urgent question that we ought to answer. But beyond the political questions, we ought to talk about how we intend to govern. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Ostalos. I think we managed to exhaust, not entirely exhaust everything, considering that others did not get the opportunity to speak. The promise we are making, as you say, that we intend to do this on a weekly basis, so that it becomes some sort of a consistent platform where we can deliberate, on possible solutions to the various issues that we want to solve as a people. Just to, before I forget, before we end, to make reference to the question on the transition and pensions. Remember, already there was a Justice Smith Commission of inquiry into pensions, into the pensions and insurance sector. And that particular commission is very, very key because it made some recommendations. So those are some of the areas where a new government will start from. Those people who lost their monies when the country transitioned from a Zim dollar to USD. So we already have documents in place at the level of the state, the issues on implementing. I just wanted to flag that out so that people can go and read and look more around that particular matter. But be that as it may, allow me to express my heartfelt appreciation, especially since we started a bit late after 35 minutes of sound hiccups. We really appreciate you spending time with us, and we're looking forward to yet another conversation on Zimbabwe, what is to be done. These are a series of conversations. Enjoy the rest of your evening. God bless you.